From Central Florida Public Media, I'm Talia Blake. Flooding and what some scientists call climate change isn't just impacting your wallet. It's also affecting local government budgets year-round. Across the country and here in Florida, municipalities rely on property tax revenue to help fund their budgets. But what happens when the property tax generators are in danger of going underwater? Here in Central Florida, Cape Canaveral is projected to lose 38% of property tax revenue by the year 2100 due to increased flooding and sea level rise. While 75 years might seem like a lot of time to change course, researchers say this sort of change takes a lot of time. Will Butler is an associate professor of urban regional planning at Florida State University, and Linda Shai is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University. They authored a study looking at the projected impacts of climate change on municipalities. They joined Chief Resilience Manager for the City of Cape Canaveral, Zach Eichels, to talk about the impacts of flooding and what's being done to help combat the issue. Linda, how exactly does flooding or sea level rise impact local government budgets in Central Florida?
Budgets are comprised of expenditures and revenues. So on the expenditure side, you can imagine all sorts of increased expenditures due to emergency response or capital investments to elevate roads or enlarge sewers or augment existing levees or seawalls. On the other side, in terms of revenues, if you have a lot of climate impacts that causes property values to decline because people think that you have to pay flood insurance or deal with flooding, that's going to affect property tax rolls. If you have demolition or buyouts of properties, that'll remove housing stock. It can also affect the number of businesses that are willing to come in and the amount of revenues that businesses are going to be able to earn, especially if there are business closures due to hurricanes or recovery types of periods. So on both sides, I think the adaptation different from carbon emissions reduction, where on the carbon emission side, you can imagine that if you do renewable energy, energy efficiency, you could make money or save money. But on the adaptation side, it's very difficult to make money from it, and there are a lot of expenses and potential for losses.
Will, can you talk about some of the key findings you all found in your study looking at Central Florida economies?
If you look at some of the work that Linda's team in particular did, you can start to identify municipalities that have a loss of revenue resources over the long term as sea level rise increases over time. So just looking at the Cape Canaveral area, there's a lot of inundation that occurs in that region along the Cape, and then along municipalities like Titusville and Satellite Beach and Cocoa Beach, they start to face these fiscal challenges, not just the physical challenges of flooding. So part of what our work tries to do is identify well ahead of time some of the risks that these communities are going to be facing, so that there's time to actually respond, to get ahead of this, to start to think about different ways to finance sea level rise adaptation work. The survey that we used was also statewide. And in that survey, what we found was most of the municipalities that responded depended greatly on local source revenues as they're kind of budgeting for sea level rise adaptation planning work, as well as for implementation of adaptation projects. So if they're simultaneously depending upon those local source revenues and facing threats to those revenues, then we see this sort of tension building between these two sides of the equation. So I think the encouraging part is not yet, right? It's like, it's not really bad quite yet. And we have some time to get ahead of it. And that's part of what our call to action is in this work.
So one of the municipalities that you mentioned was Cape Canaveral. Zach, how do you approach policy when looking at the impacts of sea level rise in Cape Canaveral?
In Cape Canaveral, we frame the policy discussion around sea level rise to be at a very local level and take it on a street-by-street basis, if you will, where we have residents that can say, in the summer times or after a particularly bad rainstorm or even a hurricane event, there is flooding in my street. What is the city going to do about it? So we can use these very real-world issues that people are seeing with their own eyes to galvanize support at the political level to move forward with flood mitigation and adaptation projects across our built environment.
Can you talk about some of those things that you all are doing or putting in place to, help those real world problems that you're talking about?
So right now, the City of Cape Canaveral is heavily investing in protecting its own infrastructure so that we can, by association, help residents and businesses out in the community. One of our flagship projects right now that we're about to undergo is the construction of the city's first permanent pump station and tidal valve system. So this is a system that will exist for specifically the Center Street stormwater drainage basin, which is an area of the city that is very prone to flooding. It has a lot of impervious surface that doesn't allow for runoff and natural infiltration. So the pump station will be situated near the outfall at the Banana River Lagoon, where this particular drainage basin empties into, and it will help pump the underground stormwater system dry so that it has maximum capacity to deal with a rain event and then to protect from backflow situations where, say, a wind-driven storm surge from a hurricane goes into the Banana River Lagoon and pushes that water into the stormwater system. The tidal valve will shut and prevent that backflow situation, and then the pump will pump water around the tidal valve and out into the lagoon safely to draw down the existing system and basically return it to almost like a pre-development level where the system will have as much capacity as it physically can to be able to handle storm situations much better. Another thing that we've been doing on the beach side is we've been doing an annual sea oak planting every year since at least 2005. That has seen almost 200,000 sea oats be planted across that time frame. We completed our most recent event in February of 2024. We planted just under 18,000 sea oats. We've seen tremendous success with this. The 2004 hurricane season devastated the coastal dunes here and really left no beach protection for coastal residents. Since then, with these planting efforts, we've been able to push the dune system back out upwards of 100 feet and have a well-vegetated dune line that performed extremely well during Hurricane Nicole in November of 2022. And then another thing that we've been doing is we've been installing a system of remote sensor sites across the city that relay data to us in real time, weather, climatological data, and water level data within the Banana River Lagoon, so we can understand what's happening to us in real time on a street by street level and relay that information to not only emergency first responders, but also to engineering firms that help us with projects such as the Center Street Basin pump station and whatnot. So that's just some of the things we've been doing.
Will, I saw you shaking your head in agreement a lot while Zach was talking.
I think what Zach's just described is a comprehensive, all of the above kind of approach to addressing some of the threats, not only of sea level rise, but of increased tropical cyclone intensification that we're going to see with climate change. And I think this is exactly what Linda was talking about earlier, that there are real costs involved in any one of these kinds of projects. And diversifying the range of revenue sources, it can really help address that, whether they're public-private revenue sharing sources, there's federal and state, as well as local kinds of resources that can be brought to bear. But there may need to also be kind of new kinds of financing mechanisms that can facilitate the kinds of investments that Zach is talking about that are going to be necessary in the future of Florida.
If I could add to what Will just said. So he's right. We're trying to implement a diverse portfolio of mitigation and adaptation projects that range from the gray to the green infrastructure side of things. But over the last 2 years, we've definitely leaned more heavily into trying to implement the green infrastructure elements, because if it's done correctly, those assets can appreciate over time, whereas you will always see a depreciation in traditional gray infrastructure that will require maintenance, upkeep, repair, monitoring. That is, of course, the case with green infrastructure, but those assets being usually plants or trees or just some other type of nature-based solution will literally grow and compound on their success. So that's why, for example, with the dune sea oak planting event, we have seen the beach redevelop its own habitat and be able to take care of itself in a sense without really much maintenance or attention by city staff, which has been very nice.
So it sounds like, based on, what Zach said and what you said yourself, Will, as well, that Cape Canaveral is taking steps in the right direction to help with the everyday problems, as Zach mentioned, of sea level rise. Linda, if this issue is not fixed, what could that mean for people living here in Central Florida?
The future is hard to predict, but in the event that there is not enough funding, and there isn't, there's far more desire for funding for infrastructure than there is funding available at either the state or local levels. These could begin to affect daily life It can affect transportation. It affects the septic tank systems. All of that begins to be problematic and inconvenient, potentially extremely costly at a household level, which affects your entire household financial assets and well-being. So at a longer term level, as that begins to accumulate and more houses and more people experience that, you can imagine that tax rolls might decrease, and then the very funding that cities need to invest in infrastructure, information, monitoring, education, all of those things is going to take a hit. And so we foresee that there would be a kind of vicious cycle potentially, that the more you're impacted, the less you're able to adapt. The less you're able to adapt, the more you're impacted, and the more that people are not adapted and well and thriving in their communities, the more people will move out. And that also compounds the cycle.
Will, I'm kind of curious, what are some of the barriers that exist when it comes to dealing with this issue?
We did in our statewide survey of coastal planners and managers in Florida, we identified a ranking of barriers based on kind of how severely they limited their progress on dealing with sea level rise adaptation. The very top by far was money. And money for implementation was the strongest barrier, and the money for planning was the second barrier. And that makes a lot of sense because in planning, you kind of need $400,000 to do your vulnerability assessment and do some public meetings and do the whole planning. And then you've got your plan, right? You've got the information necessary to make a move. For implementation, it's expensive. It's a lot of infrastructure, but based on what Zach was talking about, even just doing the COPS project is not free, right? These are expensive and ongoing expenditures. Public constituency was the lowest barrier by far. People sort of navigate this in the state of Florida as an awareness of, we have a very high concentration of our population living in coastal zones. There's an awareness of erosion over time. This is part of the normal reality of living in a dynamic coastal environment. So the constituency has been basically supportive of sea level rise planning activity. And indeed, when we have had administrations that want to not talk about climate change, they still passed policies that were absolutely focused on sea level rise adaptation being a priority in our state budgets as well as in our policies for planning. The Parallel Flood Act and the Adaptation Action Areas policy were passed during the previous administration. And so now that money is flowing through the Resilient Florida program, that may address some of those barriers around funding a little bit, although billions were requested and they only were able to fund about $600 million in projects for direct implementation of projects.
Linda, kind of bringing you back into the conversation here, I'm curious, with the way that the current system is, how is that impacting local taxpayers? How is that actually impacting people's wallets?
Long before I think the sea level rise gets to a point where you feel it on your doorstep, there are the societal responses to that risk, which key among those is insurance. You can get foreclosed on through lack of payment for flood insurance before you get actually physically underwater, right? So you can fiscally go underwater before you go physically underwater. And that's true at a household level and at a municipal level. So on the one hand, you see that insurance companies are trying to lower their own risks from climate change. And so they're going to start escalating those costs in order to try to get to an actuarial level where their costs equal their damages that they have to pay out. On the other hand, at some point, what we're seeing is that insurance companies are beginning to pull out of places that they perceive to be extremely at risk. So I think that it's the risks and the impacts are not just from the physical, environmental side, but a lot of the financial aspects of what we're trying to get. There's evidence that mortgage lenders are paying attention, and in some cases, especially local lenders that are more in tune to local properties and conditions, are beginning to be more averse about lending mortgages to places that are in the flood zone. Some people have called this kind of blue lining as opposed to red lining. And so that's going to start impacting those kinds of properties and who can even buy and sell their homes at the values that they want to think about.
Linda, quick follow-up question. Based on the way the system is currently set up, who benefits the most from it?
This question of who benefits the most is, I think, complicated. When we map who currently is going to be the most impacted by sea level rise and the potential for fiscal losses, the cities that are the smallest by population and land area, that are the richest and that are the whitest, are going to be among the most impacted. So you can imagine a lot of small barrier island municipalities. That is basically a lot of the demographics that we're talking about seeing the most impact, because they're very small. There's nowhere else to spread that risk. There's nobody generating tax dollars except for residential properties, which tend to be in mid to high rise condo kinds of housing. So on the one hand, you would say who's most impacted? It's those kinds of groups. I think at the same time, what we would imagine seeing, and we're already seeing, is that people who are mobile, who have the flexibility to easily move and say, I don't want to live in such a flood risk zone, I'm going to move somewhere else, that is a demographic that we know is either going to be the much wealthier set of folks, and conversely, people who are disproportionately lower income. So disaster data nationwide shows that lower income people tend to be more likely to be displaced after an event because they don't have the resources to rebuild housing, or maybe they're renters and they are evicted as a result of the loss of housing. And so there is a potential then for people who are able to move to safer housing. What we're seeing in Miami and elsewhere in Florida is that people are moving from coastal areas to inland higher ground. So I think the concern of who is going to benefit from this kind of resiliency planning, there can be many variations as to that question, but a real concern that groups that historically have benefited from public investment, subsidies, taxes, housing, preferential development of various kinds are again going to be better able to avail of safer, more resilient housing, while groups that historically have not benefited from those investments are again going to be shafted to less resilient, more flood-prone, and now more affordable housing in low-lying places.
To build on that, I think if I'm looking at the current system, who stands to benefit most, I'd probably also include in that developers. When you have a disaster, developers are needed. They come in and they rebuild. So disaster actually feeds GDP. You know, disaster is a good thing for the economy. I don't think it's particularly a great thing to experience, but it certainly feeds the economic engines of development activity, which Florida depends greatly on. It's one of our highest economic engines in the state. So I think it's sort of predisposed to have developers be able to continue to do quite well in the current context, even as the events of sea level rise and climate intensification of disasters and storms and things happens.
So speaking of benefits, and Zach, I know you had something you wanted to mention on that. Can you kind of elaborate on how the City of Cape Canaveral is using collaborations to make sure that this system will benefit the people living there?
Climate change is such a broad issue. There's no way a city of our size could go it alone. We are developing a pretty broad coalition of partners from the public and private sector to help us in a number of ways, whether that is direct project involvement and planning, funding. We are trying to use as many resources as we can. One of the primary resources that we've been using is the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council. They've been pretty invaluable to help us with many things, including acquiring grants to help fund projects. Another good example of collaboration that we've been working on is a grant that we were awarded by the National Science Foundation last year through the Civic Innovation Challenge program. We recently completed the development of a rain garden at Veterans Memorial Park. This particular project had, including the city, 14 grant partners on it, which was the most we've ever had.
One of my last questions, how do you get people to understand the immediacy of needing to act on a problem like sea level rise in Central Florida, given the impacts we've seen so far?
So I'll go back to a study I did back in 2015 when we were looking at what sea level rise planning activities were happening in the state of Florida at that time. And through the interviews that we did around the state, one of the things that arose to the top was the idea of hazard salience. And what we found was that it didn't really matter if people were experiencing sea level rise or climate change impacts from a scientific angle. Is this attributable to climate change? We don't know. But if the suggestion that it could have been climate change or sea level rise related, that was enough, right? So then all of a sudden, people in that municipality were very interested in trying to address phenomena associated with coastal flooding and sea level rise. And that hazard salience can last for a few years. So I hate to say that you need a disaster in order to do something about it, but that certainly was one of the motivating factors. It doesn't mean there aren't other motivators, but it certainly was one of them that facilitated more progressive, quicker kinds of actions to sort of set the stage for the next level of issues that they were trying to deal with in different municipalities around the state that were taking action at that time.
I would say a big accelerant that we've used in the last few years was Hurricane Ian. We saw firsthand community members in Cape Canaveral, which by comparison was not that affected by Ian when you look at what happened on the west coast of Florida, but it genuinely scared a lot of individuals. I think it was a wake-up call for many who had recently moved to the state after so many people have come here in the last few years. We were able to use it to really push forward a few different projects where we saw several vulnerabilities highlighted through Ian's passage. And as Will was saying, it is kind of a dark race, but you never let a good crisis go to waste. So you definitely use what you can see while it's fresh in the public eye to be able to move the needle forward and put in more mitigation and adaptation based on real world occurrence that, completely changed the state of Florida only a few years ago. So that's something that has allowed us to move relatively fast.
To pivot off of Zach's point about opportunity, there's an opportunity to kind of re-envision how we're doing things. And if we take that opportunity, then we can look at the current system we have and think about resilience not just as we want to strengthen what we have, but we want to improve it. So there are pieces of the system that we have the opportunity to improve, to make better, to make more equitable, to make more sustainable, to make more just, to make healthier opportunities for thriving communities and for people to live in these thriving places. If we want people to stay in Florida and to thrive in Florida, we should be working on those aspects too, because we need a place where it's an inclusive place where people can live for the long term.
The last thing that I was going to add was we like to look at what we do as a marathon, although I'm sure some would say we should be sprinting. As much as I would like to sprint, not everyone can sprint. So we try and take along as many people as we can on this marathon. And in some of the projects that we do, a lot of it does deal with the fact that they are to acclimatize individuals to what we're doing so that we can build it out even more in the long term.
Zach, Linda, Will, thank you all so much for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Talia.
Thanks, Talia.
Absolutely.
That was Cape Canaveral's Zach Eichels, FSU's Will Butler, and Cornell University's Linda Shai. To hear more of Central Florida Public Media's Seen and Heard series Rising Water, visit our website, cfpublic.org.